Objective, Odessa. Putin has already decided. Odessa represents a Russian city and must be reconquered by Russia. What we have predicted on this channel 1,000 times is finally confirmed. Meanwhile, the Russian armed forces carried out a brutal airstrike yesterday against the port of Odessa in response to Ukraine's attacks on Russian merchant ships. The Russian offensive against Odessa has finally begun. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 305 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and our PayPal account. Joining us on the other side of the screen, and the other side of the European continent, from the beautiful city of Madrid, Spain, is Mr. Fernando Moragón. Hello, Fernando, how are you? Everything all right over there?
Señor Fernando Moragón. Hola, Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien, yo voy a aprovechar como siempre porque pues hay buenos días.
All right. I'm going to take advantage as always because, well, there are good mornings, good afternoons, good evenings. Since I'm a complainer, because I am a complainer, I'm going to take this chance to complain about something. If I don't complain about something, I don't feel right. So now Christmas is coming, the holidays, happiness, joy, Santa Claus under the banner of Santa Claus, then in January the three wise men and all that, and these things fine. So well, Madrid fills up with lights, beautiful lights along the streets, little trees and so on. I think that's great. Great because the city council pays for it. There are some places where, let's say, the shops pay for it and so on, but, well, the street lighting in general is the city council's responsibility. And you say, oh, thank goodness we have Christmas and the lights. Not because of the holidays themselves, but because for 1 month a year, we can actually see at night. Because ever since they installed those very eco-friendly, low brightness, low power lights and all that, you can't see a thing in Madrid. And this can be clearly shown. And those of us who are half blind, like me, that's why I wear glasses, well, we walk around barely avoiding bumping into trees by sheer luck. So it turns out that all year long we're half in the dark, the neighborhoods are poorly lit, and on top of that there's terrible synchronization between the trees and the lights. That is, someone, sometime in the 90s or so, said, oh, how can we discourage Madrilenians from using their cars as little as possible? Above all, it was to stop people from parking, because that was when they started installing parking meters, meaning you had to pay to park in certain areas if you weren't a resident. Well, they said, we have a solution. Between each parking space, we'll plant little trees, and that way we'll gradually reduce the number of parking spots. This brilliant idea from someone at City Hall at the time, whoever it was, failed to foresee an unexpected element, something absolutely unthinkable, something that couldn't possibly have been predicted, that trees are alive and they grow. Wow, absolutely inconceivable, really. I don't know how, I can understand how such an absurd idea could never have crossed their minds, that trees are alive and they grow. Of course, they planted little trees, so there was no problem. But the little trees grow, time passes, and they started spreading into the first floors, the second floors. There were people who opened their windows, and it looked like they were in the Amazon. All kinds of bugs and stuff came in. And not only that, because even though they trim these things from time to time, many of the lights are installed on the building walls, let's say, at a certain height. Naturally, if the little tree grows, it ends up wrapping what little light we already had in its branches. So, yeah. Here, where I live, well, not far from here, the stretch where I live looks like Alibaba's dark cave. You can't see a thing. Luckily, there are a few shops that leave their lights on at night, and you think, thank goodness. At least that way you don't crash into something. Anyway, that said, we have lights at Christmas, but not the rest of the year. It would be better if we had lights all year round and not just at Christmas. It's not that I'm against Christmas, which I am, but I mean, I've never really been. Well, I think it's fine.
Quiero decir que yo nunca he sido. A ver, me parece muy bien. La fiesta de las Navidades a mí, para la gente que es creyente.
The Christmas holidays, for me, for people who are believers and all that, and those things seem great. But the thing is, this isn't new. This already happened when I was a kid. I mean, this stopped being a religious holiday a long time ago. It turned into the big celebration, the great apotheosis of consumerism. Let's go shopping, let's spend, come on, everyone get together to eat. I mean, we can't get together without stuffing ourselves. And well, let's spend the Christmas bonus. Come on, and not just the Christmas one. We'll also spend January's, and then we'll just use the credit card however we can. That's how it is.
Fernando, you, being a true Madrileñan, grumble about the city of Madrid, but at the same time, you love it deeply. Just like us, the people of Buenos Aires, always cursing our city, but deep down, when we're away from Buenos Aires, oh, how one longs to return to Buenos Aires. And that's why this video Fernando sent the other day shows one of the beautiful things about Madrid. Not everything is ugly, of course.
The other day I showed you the dump next to my house. Well, here we can see something completely surreal. It's true there's a park not too far away, but here we can see a beautiful peacock calmly strolling through the streets of Madrid. They usually go back to where they came from. I'm not sure if they do it on their own or if the caretakers come to get them. But here you can see it, perfectly at ease, without any problem. I get closer, and it doesn't do anything strange either. And well, these are the kinds of things Madrid and Europe have, places that keep getting more surprising. I wouldn't recommend it eat anything lying around though, because as you can see, that's also part of the dump. So that's how it is. Until next time, see you. Yeah, it's a bit surreal.
Yes, a few hours ago, I walked through the park near my house, and, despite the cold, the little rats again. They couldn't film them. No, I remembered. This, let's see. But I remembered you, the little rats.
The little mice. Oh, take out a bit of cheese or something like that. You'll see how they come. And you say, yes, 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 whatever, and the little mice come and...
You end up getting fond of them. When so many have become part of the urban landscape, I walk through the park with my son counting rats, and everyone's happy.
But I want to ask you a question.
A question. Go ahead, Fernando.
How is the lighting in Berlin? Berlin, the great capital of Germany.
Berlin has always been a very dark city. And now, well, since the beginning of the war, even more so. The little lighting infrastructure that exists seems largely turned off at night as a result of the federal government's measures and decisions to save as much as possible, including on lighting. If the parks and streets were already quite dark, now they're much darker. Compared to Berlin, Madrid is much brighter, Fernando.
Mucho más luminosa, Fernando, ¿eh? Uno recorre un parque en Berlín y recorre una cueva de lobos.
You walk through a park in Berlin and it feels like walking through a wolf's den. Something that until not long ago didn't cause any concern because of the city's low crime rate. But with the rise in inequality in recent years and a whole range of issues tied to social marginalization, many cases have already been documented. Not only attacks, but murders in the parks, rapes, and so on. All happening in the dark. Everything is very, very dark. And well, this is largely due to the savings linked to sending money to the war in Ukraine. That's how twisted it all is. And among all that, the rats.
Y entre eso, las ratas. Entre eso,
las ratas. No, Berlín, que yo estuve hace mucho tiempo. Yo estuve en el siglo pasado, pero...
I was there a long time ago, in the last century. But it was a very beautiful city. I stayed at a friend's house and all that. And it was a really spectacular city. And yes, now that you mention it, it wasn't a very well-lit place, but well, fine. But of course, if they turn off the lights completely, I mean, you arrive in Berlin at night, by plane or whatever, and you have to find the hotel, I don't know, or Pepito Perez's house, and you have a hard time if you don't know Berlin, because you don't know a thing, from what you're telling me.
Sí, además de todo eso, históricamente, por una cuestión...
On top of all that, historically, for reasons tied to environmentalism or a love of nature, for example, when the weather gets warm and the grass in a city with many parks starts to grow, getting taller, sometimes quite tall, 30 or 40 centimeters, and partly also because the city, broken as it is, the city of Berlin, has shown a tremendous red hue practically since reunification. A broken city, dirty, poorly lit, and that's also why it feels so alive, isn't it?
Iluminación, por eso tan viva también, ¿no? Es un caos, pero un caos, hasta hace poco un caos muy bonito, ahora...
It's chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Until recently, a very beautiful kind of chaos, and now a bit of an unmanageable one. Well, so, in summer, all the parks, the sidewalks, the green strips, all of them with grass almost up to knee height, more or less. So quite a wild landscape. Lately, unfortunately, all that picturesque charm is gone, giving way to something more marginal. Unfortunately, like all of Europe. But well, Fernando, already 1,300 demolishers, and here we are. Well, we'll see.
Acá, bueno, pero vamos a ver. Esto es como con los libros. Es decir,
look, it's like with books. I mean, when you start a book, imagine a book that's a bit heavy and all that, let's say, about philosophy and so on. You start from the beginning, because from the point of view of the metaphysics of each, whatever, and you go, wow. You'd rather have an introduction, something lighter, where they tell you a bit about what the book is about, just to get your footing, to build up some strength. Because if you dive right in, it's like with swimming pools. You dip your foot in, splash a bit of water on yourself to get used to the temperature, and then you go in. Because jumping straight in all at once is really tough.
Indeed, indeed. But we, finally, after this introduction, take the plunge into the cold waters of this geopolitical pool called Ukraine. The Black Sea in particular, Fernando, because between yesterday and today, Russia carried out tremendous attacks against the city of Odesa. Specifically yesterday, with the help of this chart here, this is today, this is yesterday. Yesterday, 495 attacks, most of them against the Odesa region, of which 417 were with drones, 5 Iskander-K missiles, the cruise Iskanders, 16 Caliber cruise missiles, 4 Kinjal hypersonic missiles, and 5 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, with a new development. Because yesterday, they not only targeted the critical infrastructure of the city of Odesa, but also ships located in the port of Odesa, clearly in response to the Ukrainian attacks on vessels of the so-called Russian fleet in the shadows, 2 days earlier in the Black Sea. Attention to the images.
This image is spectacular, truly spectacular, one of the drones. But notice that there won't be any stratospheric accelerations either. These drones can fly at 300 kilometers per hour at most.
Finally, I think they are decreasing.
This, more or less, means, here comes the mess that's about to happen, translated from Lucarnian.
Yes, or Russian, because most of the population speaks Russian.
It's Russian-speaking, yes. It was a city founded by Russia and also by a Spaniard.
Anyway, that's his story.
And there you can clearly see how it hits a ferry. What's a ferry? Well, a ferry is for carrying cars, right? Yes, but it wasn't carrying cars. Or maybe it was carrying something else. It was carrying, and that's the key point, diesel generators.
That's one of the images. Shortly after, the ferry is seen burning.
Yes. Firefighters.
Bien. Y por aquí, bueno, más.
Well, and over here, more images of this large ferry on fire. Also, as usual, the attacks caused the destruction of critical electrical infrastructure, such as this generator here.
eléctrica, como por ejemplo este generador aquí.
In fact, I think that same night the power went out in Odessa. Then I suppose they got it back, at least partially.
Fernando, these are the images of Odessa, completely in the dark.
In the dark. Tremendous, tremendous.
And in the background, yes, indeed, the sound of a drone.
These are the Shaheeds, you've already seen them. They make a sound like this. A very distinctive buzz, like a siren, like a scooter. Exactly. And that's intentional. I mean, they took some inspiration from the Stukas, if you remember the planes from World War II, the famous light bombers. They carried out dive attacks and had sirens to create that extra psychological effect. That's why they added it.
Look, another one.
This one, what an explosion.
Indeed, you can hear the noise here. Fernando, I'm going to step back. Let's see.
Careful, huh? Aha, here comes the device. Crude.
Crude. This. People speaking with more. Does that sound more like Arabic than Russian or Ukrainian?
This was filmed from a ship, so maybe the crew. For example, if we know that the crew wasn't harmed on this vessel that was attacked by the Russians, which we just saw being hit by a drone, a Shahed or a Garin to be more precise, they were mostly, I think, of Turkish origin. And well, as usually happens in ports, the crews of ships, regardless of the flag they sail under, tend to come from all over, and behind every port you find people speaking all kinds of languages.
This sounds more like Turkish than Arabic. Actually, how do you determine that? Well, remember that Berlin is considered the third Turkish city in the world. It's full of Turks here. So I hear Turkish every day. My neighbors upstairs, my neighbors downstairs, all Turks or German Turks. So the sound of Turkish is quite familiar to me. These images are spectacular.
Spectacular. I recommend you take a look. They're photographs, but they're incredible. On one hand, they're very beautiful because they were taken so well. They captured a perfect moment. The photographer who took them is very talented. But on the other hand, they're eerie. Because, well, you'll see. They're spectacular because they're eerie. That is, it's Odessa without light. A very beautiful city, with many, it was called, if I remember correctly, the Pearl of the Black Sea and the great port city of the Black Sea since its founding by Catherine the Great in the 18th century. And, well, as I said, it's spectacular. Notice, on one hand, that contrast between the beauty of the photograph and a world without light, a port city. You can see cranes in the background, houses, some of them very old, a church, you can see the dome of a church there, and all kinds of buildings from the Soviet era and earlier. Look at it under the moonlight. What an incredible image.
Incredible.
Of a certain beauty, and at the same time, that a world without light, a city without light. And this, mind you, is understandable in the sense that it's the result of attacks and war. But, as Ezequiel and I were talking about in Berlin, in Madrid, and throughout Europe in general, we're heading toward a world without light, because we'll have less and less electric power. Let's not fool ourselves. I mean, the so-called cuts made by one side and the other go in that direction, toward a situation of mere subsistence, practically, where people live just a little above subsistence and accept all kinds of cutbacks that lead us, well, to dark cities at night. Because, why spend? We have to save. The Russians are coming, that's what they keep telling us. And so, well, that's where things stand. But the photos really struck me when I saw them, precisely because of that. The terrifying beauty of a city without light.
La aterradora belleza de una ciudad sin luz.
With the reflection, with the moonlight, a full, spectacular moon. Yesterday, 495 attacks. This morning, 139, some of them also on Odesa. Here, for example, the images. This is a bit farther south of Odesa. The Russians attacking another port area as well. There again, that noise, the anti-aircraft machine guns, not very effective.
Sistemas antiaéreos, digamos, clásicos,
that image. Tremendous. Classic anti-air systems, meaning anti-aircraft guns and so on. Well, yes, they can shoot down a few Shaheds and not much else. A few geraniums, because they fly very slowly and low. But they really don't stand a chance, except in very rare cases, against the Iskanders, and even less so against the Kinzhal. I'm not sure if this launch belongs to earlier ones, because I just sent you something. I just remembered. You probably have it somewhere. The sound of the Zircon missiles, in a video from Geopolitical Wars. It's spectacular, because you'll see they have nothing to do with it. As they say there in Geopolitical Wars, they're kind of like Star Wars. The sound has nothing to do with that. Let's see if we can look at it later. Now, well, but look at this, the car batteries. Notice that this car batteries, some lighting from a business, maybe a store that has an electric or diesel generator or something like that, and not much else. And this is key. Why is it key? We'll see that calmly in a moment. It's the same old story. The strange thing, as always, is why the Russians took so long to do this.
Look, you can see everything from there.
And, as always, the Russians have been doing this for a long time. Attacks on specific points, specific targets, with many Shahed or Geranium-2 drones, sometimes Geranium-3. That way, even if some are shot down, in the end they still hit their targets. And since they're so cheap to produce, about $30,000 or $40,000 per unit I think it was, well, of course, that's what we're seeing. In other words, as you pointed out, it's not that the Russians are bombing daily anymore.
It's your video, Fernando. Pay attention to the sound. Once again, to all the demolishers, remember the excellent Telegram channel Wars and Geopolitics, our sister channel, one of the best in Spanish.
Tremendous, huh? The sound. Nothing like the other one, which has more of a bumblebee buzz, let's say. And this one is, it seems...
So much human ingenuity devoted to destruction throughout the history of humankind, Fernando. What a lousy species. So much brilliance put in the service of weapons.
Let's see, I'm probably going to say it wrong, but roughly speaking, it goes like this. It's from a very famous biologist, an evolutionary biologist, Wilson, E.O. Wilson, if I remember correctly. It goes something like this, right? Human beings have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. I think that phrase is very accurate, indeed. It's not exact, but something along those lines. The guy is E.O. Wilson, a famous evolutionary biologist, if I'm not mistaken, and the phrase goes something like this. Human beings have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and technology worthy of the gods, as if we were gods. This combination is lethal. It's very primitive from an emotional point of view, even from a behavioral one, and so on, with a very unsophisticated way of governing. Liberal democracies, autocracies, I think they're very strange. And there I was, reading about Aristotle's politics. And then, of course, the famous oppositions between oligarchy, aristocracy, monarchy, tyranny, and so on, and democracy. Well, democracy is the degenerate form. Aristotle doesn't call it populism, but rather, well, the republic would be something like a mixed system, made up of property-owning citizens with means who can afford their own weapons, that is, hoplites, with expensive equipment for the time. And the degeneration of the republic would be democracy, if I remember correctly. And from Aristotle's point of view, and I was mentioning it precisely because that's what we have, we're still circling around forms of government that Aristotle was already considering. That is, we're talking about more than 2,000 years ago, and we're still going around in circles about political questions and ways of governing ourselves.
In ancient Greece, the level of deliberation, and yes, we must remember this, was such that for every Athenian citizen, there were 8 male slaves behind him, and that number doubled if we included women. So in order to sustain Athenian direct democracy, its deliberations, and Greek philosophy, behind each of those great visionaries, like Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates, there were 16 people, 8 slaves and their wives, 16 or 17 people in total. That's true. But when it comes to the richness of their deliberations, their concerns, their moral questions, they were far ahead of the barbarity of our current capitalist societies. It's just that we now have a technical power that's out of control, far greater. And that's where naturally much of the danger lies, isn't it? It's as if we're regressing as a species in many ways. Not technically, but civilizationally. Yes, we are going backward.
That's the problem. I mean, first of all, as you rightly pointed out, there were the slaves who were not citizens. There were the women who were not citizens. There were the foreigners, the metics, who were not citizens either. So the actual number of theoretical citizens was very small, and in practice, it was even smaller. But those who had the time to go, for example, farmers and so on, who were citizens, who had their slaves and all that, were the ones who had enough time to leave their village and spend days there, deliberating and arguing, right? That's clear. But let's imagine we extend the concept of citizenship to include former slaves, women, or foreigners, and so on. And the group of people, I mean, the people who lived in that era, if we could take a camera and say to them, come on, pose and all that, right? Both in the classical and the Hellenistic periods, I mean, bringing together Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Eratosthenes, more from the Hellenistic period, for example, or Democritus, or even the sophists themselves. That is, we would have a family photo that we'd look at and say, this would be impossible now. I mean, whether one agrees with them or not, the kind of intellectual capacity they had, gathering so many great minds like those, would be impossible today. I mean, I think the closest thing, I was remembering it the other day, the closest we've ever been to that is a photo, I can't remember now. It's a meeting that took place in the 1920s, maybe the 1930s, around that time. I think in the 1930s, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, the 1920s or 1930s. It's a historic photo, because that one really is a true photo, and it's something that will never be repeated. I think, probably never. And it's a photo where you can see Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Marie Curie, Werner Heisenberg, and as far as I remember, for example, Erwin Schrödinger. All of them there. My God, I mean, what a privilege. The relativistic and quantum physics of the time and the Nobel laureates. This is unrepeatable. This will never happen again.
There are also photos from the 1920s of the great philosophers of that time, Bertrand Russell, Einstein, and so on. 10 years before the Nazi barbarism, right? A sign of the times. Anyway, Fernando, today we were, or are, going to focus on Odesa, on the situation at the front. But first, I want to make a brief digression about the current situation, right now, with Zelensky here in Berlin. All of this, of course, is connected, related, his arrival today, as always, with that little trick of people greeting him. But here I go, a pause if I may. There, in the shot, the officer greeting him, from Ukraine, no one waiting for Zelensky here, on a lightning and surprise trip, to take part in a negotiation, or at least in a meeting. Here are more images, this a bit later. This here, the meeting of the Germans, if I remember correctly, with Bistoletti before the meeting. Well, Zelensky in Berlin for a meeting with Bistoletti and Kushner. There, Zelensky.
ellos, por lo menos hasta hace un rato, reunidos aquí en Berlín.
They, at least until a little while ago, were gathered here in Berlin. Yes, the last thing I was able to see right before we started was that they had held a meeting lasting about 5 hours and had taken a break until tomorrow morning, when the negotiations would continue. That's the next to last thing I've been able to find out. But look at the European backlash. It's coming from all sides now. I mean, this sort of trio of troublemakers, Merz, Steimer, and Macron, and so on, is facing more and more opposition. And not just from the usual suspects, right? Well, Viktor Orban's words these days have been extremely harsh toward the European Union. And the Belgian statements, now that they're caught up in the mess over the expropriation of Russian assets, are striking. But for example, Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, has said that Ukraine is a black hole that causes billions of euros to be lost, a rational economic thought and a sustainable future for the European Union. But even the Italians are already starting to say, this can't go on. And Salvini, the Italian Deputy Prime Minister, has said that Europe is boycotting the peace process because Macron, Steinmeier, and other leaders are in a difficult situation in their own countries, and that's why they need to project their French or British problems outward. But when a country has 6,000 nuclear warheads, referring to Russia, the best path forward is dialogue. Obviously, a very convincing argument from Salvini, it must be said.
Yes, the most well-founded arguments of a neo-fascist like Salvini.
Right, I mean, this is what's outrageous, that the reasonable ones are the far right. This is the height of Europe's absurdity, I mean.
Here, Fernando, the few images released so far show the meeting already taking place inside what I believe is the government house, the site of this gathering between Zelensky, Witkoff, and Kushner. Basically, Trump's buddy Witkoff and Kushner, his son-in-law. It's Trump's team, right? And on the other side, yes, his friends and family. And by the way, it's better that they went instead of him sending Kellogg or some of the neocon hawks around him, or Marco Rubio. At least these guys are more interested in business than in the continuation of the war itself, unlike all the other hawks. And there you have Umarov, Zelensky, and Merz's agent, at the start of this meeting.
But look at several things that are already surprising. First, that Zelensky is wearing a jacket. That's not usual. That means things are really bad. If he already has to wear a jacket, and if tomorrow we see him with a tie, that would mean they're on their last legs. In other words, that would be the end of it. But then, notice that there are negotiations. If you analyze it, it's absurd. There's a war between the Ukrainians and the Russians, or the Russians and the Ukrainians, whichever way you want to put it. Supposedly, the ones who should be negotiating, maybe through intermediaries, however they choose, are the Russians and the Ukrainians. And who do we have sitting here? On one side, the Americans, who supposedly aren't at war, unless they're the ones who caused the whole mess. Well, the Trump administration, which isn't at war and is negotiating peace, must be practically made of stone when dealing with Umarov and others, with the Europeans, with Scholz, with Merkel, with Macron. But the Europeans aren't at war either, meaning two blocs that aren't at war are negotiating the end of a war in which they supposedly, in quotes, aren't participating. I mean, come on, this is Kafkaesque. It's completely insane. And well, I think basically what Witkoff and Jared Kushner are going to put in front of Zelensky and the Europeans, and that's why these 5 hours go by without reaching any agreements, and why they'll continue tomorrow, is a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Like, look, here's this little piece of paper. Yes, fine, it's a surrender. We can dress it up a bit if you want, but it's a surrender. Sign it. Basically. Right? And if you don't sign it, face the consequences.
Watching for the arrival of Stubb, the Finnish president. He's arriving late, with a much smaller entourage. He probably wanted to take a little tour around. Well, no, that's an out-of-place comment. He must have wanted a bit of fun in Berlin. Yes, he's coming here too, but he's coming kind of
Come on, sports and all that. What is this? Such little formality for something so important. Can you imagine? The city of Berlin completely paralyzed, of course, because of all this. I can already picture it. Today it must be a real joy to drive through Berlin. Everything jammed.
Yeah, I don't have a car, but I'm right here, very close to all this, hearing police sirens and helicopters all the time. Apparently, even this was wanted. This, Bild, the most read newspaper here, a piece of trash, but anyway, that's the reality. Here, for example, there are snipers, something never seen before. Since a river runs through Berlin, today there are also police jet skis patrolling the Spree. No idea what the river's name is in Spanish, probably also Spree. There are more images. Well, total chaos here. Chaos. I mean, look, the police are right around here. But notice that these are the ones who make these huge deployments, and not even a fly gets through.
But still, there are these so-called ghost drones flooding Europe, and there's never a single photo, testimony, or anything. I mean, right now in Berlin, there's no one around, but surely, if there were Russian ghost drones, they'd have no trouble flying by. And tomorrow, the press could easily run a headline like, 30 ghost drones attack Berlin while Zelensky meets with Trump's representatives and things like that no one has ever seen. Of course, this is a level of contradiction. I mean, massive security deployments, we've seen them in every major city whenever there's a big event, and there are more and more of those every day. And yet you can't show me a single piece of evidence of these so-called ghost drones. Please.
Moreover, Fernando, one more contradiction added to all the contradictions just mentioned. Even if Zelensky were to endorse the peace plan proposed by Trump, despite the opposition of the Europeans and others, the Russians have already decided that they will make the final decision on this matter on the battlefield. Because none of the attempts to negotiate with Russia produced the expected results. All were rejected since 2008, basically, when the NATO summit in Bucharest determined the future admission of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. All of Russia's attempts to reach a negotiated solution were rejected, even with confirmation from the negotiator, or the US official assigned to Europe. We recently discussed this in a talk with Juan Antonio Aguilar, referring to one of those prank calls by Boban. I can't recall the other name, Boban and Lexus, who indeed responded, confirming that the Russians had sought a negotiation that was rejected. Also, the peace agreement signed, or rather, the nearly finalized agreement in Turkey. And the Russians, in the end, tired, I don't want to put it crudely, but yes, tired, to put it better, finally decided that they will resolve this conflict on the battlefield. So, even with all these contradictions about who participates, who doesn't, who endorses the agreement or not, in the end, everything has only relative validity, because what is actually determining things on the ground? The attacks we saw at the beginning of the broadcast, in Odesa, and the advances across the entire battlefield make everything even more nightmarish, more contradictory, and more terrible as well, don't they?
Of course it's unreal, it's like two parallel worlds. The real world, the battlefield one, as you point out, is that of a Russia that is going to win. And that, as happens with winners, whether you like it or not, imposes its conditions. It has always been this way. And a Europe and a Zelensky who no longer matter. Let's not forget that, even though he's still the expired president, Zelensky is a political corpse. That is, regime, agents, and others in Ukraine are already openly talking about the need for change. And that's why he's now coming out with these somewhat illogical statements. No, now yes, I'll hold elections and so on, because he's desperate and under internal pressure. But there's a deeper problem. And that deeper problem is that, okay, let's imagine, well, two deeper problems. Kaczynski says, fine, all right, I'll accept whatever you propose. The Russians, the Martians, everyone. And he says, okay. Then Alfonso comes in and says, well, yes, that sounds fine to me, but the thing is, you're not in any position to assert anything. I mean, you have no internal legitimacy, none of your own, from your own constitution. So whether you accept or don't accept is meaningless. It leads nowhere. Someone with legality, or rather with legitimacy too, but with legality, will have to come, meaning someone who legally has authority from the Ukrainian constitutional point of view to sign something, even if it's unconditional surrender. Because even if Zelensky signs unconditional surrender, that paper is worthless. That will carry weight, which means he's no longer an interlocutor. He never was, especially since May of last year when his term ended. But now less than ever. And then there's the other problem.
Here's the cover of Foreign Policy, Fernando. So they can say it themselves, by the way. This is one of the 2 or 3 most important publications in the world dedicated to international relations and the theory of international relations, naturally American. Foreign Policy was founded by Huntington in the 70s as a rival to Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs dates back to the 20s, 1920, if I remember correctly, and these are the 2 organs of US strategic intelligence, where they deliberate and even engage in disputes over the best foreign policy for the United States, always from an imperialist perspective, and with the aim of imposing US hegemony.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm quite absent-minded, but Foreign Affairs, if I remember correctly, belongs to or was founded as the more or less official, or used to be, magazine of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations.
If I remember correctly, yes, in the 20s. Yes, in the 20s.
Careful. I'm saying this because it's a little-known organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations isn't something official, but it has a lot of power. I mean, people, for example, talk about Bilderberg and say, well, yes, the Bilderberg Club and all that, because that's where the real decisions are made and big issues are discussed. We even talk about the trilateral. Well, yes, when one of the Rockefellers, David Rockefeller, who founded the trilateral, was there. But the Council on Foreign Relations is less well known, and all the influential people are there. I mean, careful, it's a place where more decisions are probably made than in Washington itself, than in the White House itself.
And here Putin has already won. He has exposed fatal divisions in the West, even as Russians still support his invasion of Ukraine. It's written by a man, a theorist named Michael Hirsch. There's a photo of Putin, and here's the article about this situation. They've already said it themselves, Fernando, so it couldn't be clearer.
When the American elites and their major media outlets already reflect this, including those supposedly expert in international relations and all that, have changed the narrative and now say the Russians have won, that Putin has won, well, it's clear. In other words, this is now so obvious that there's no other way to see it. It's obvious because, moreover, they're noticing an increase, so to speak, because, well, an increase in the aggressiveness, let's call it that, of the Russians. Because, as we've said from the beginning, the Russians have waged a war that, as Putin himself said, was surgical, with a scalpel. That is something he had already warned about. If it ever came to waging war against the Europeans, the scalpel would be put away. It would no longer be surgical, it would be blunt force.
But look, translation of that, for those not very familiar with the topic. Basically, in a war with Europe, the avant-garde could very well start coming down. And why not? Maybe a Sarmat or some other one. We'll see indeed.
Yes, yes. If we have to cut power to Germany or France, there would be no problem.
Still, at this rate, Fernando, it's quite possible that by the time the war between Russia and Germany begins, Germany will already be out of energy by its own doing.
Yes, the same thing will happen to them as it did to the Americans in Afghanistan. They bombed a few things when they went in back in 2001. And since there was nothing there, well, there was nothing to... they only had those Toyotas with machine guns. They didn't have military or non-military targets. So the same thing will happen here. They won't have anything to bomb. But anyway, he said it.
Let's begin with the political military analysis.
Let's start with Odessa.
What is the meaning of this latest attack for the first time against merchant ships, against a ferry? Clearly, it is a response to previous Ukrainian attacks. What are we witnessing here?
Look, this is important. Putin already said it. He warned about it. After there were 2 attacks on what they call shadow tankers, Russian and so on, the ones carrying oil and gas, those tankers. Well, after that attack on 2 of them in the Black Sea, which luckily were empty, they were very showy. On top of that, the Ukrainians even publicized it. They made some spectacular videos, admitting it was them. Then, when Putin spoke, they started denying it, as if saying, look, this could backfire on us. But at first they spread it everywhere, saying, look at that, drone attacks, such precision, how great, with subjective camera shots from the drone. Anyway, very spectacular, since Ezekiel put them here, those videos, right? So, well, Putin already said, well, this is as far as we go. Let's remember this goes way back. It comes from the agreements made, let's say, at the beginning of the war to make it easier to sell grain. That was the excuse to the Third World and all that. But in the end, nothing reached the Third World. Anyway, there have already been 4 of them, meaning everything stayed in Europe, basically, and so on. But well, it was supposed to make trade easier and all that. And an agreement was made with the UN, with Turkey as mediator and so on. This mainly benefited the Turks, who could keep doing all kinds of trade, legal and illegal. Erdogan always plays all the cards at every table. Basically, Putin went along with it because of the good relations he has with Erdogan on many issues, which doesn't mean they agree on everything or are friends in every respect. In fact, they're at odds on many things, but that's politics. And above all, Erdogan is someone you can't trust at all. So, well, he went along with it and so on. The problem is that, after these latest attacks, the message has been, this is as far as we go. Besides, he's now in a much stronger position with greater capabilities. And you see, that's when he made a comment that basically went something like this. He said, well, let's see, this whole thing with Odessa and the port of Odessa, it's already turned into a joke where anyone can come in and, saying, no, I'm bringing flowers for the brides and all that. No. And then they bring in a shipment of weapons. Well, that's not going to fly. And he basically said, look, because of these attacks on international trade in the Black Sea, this is going to end. We're going to start, as we're seeing, with heavy attacks on port facilities, tougher than the ones we'd seen up to that point, which were already quite strong. But now we won't just target energy infrastructure. We'll also attack, well, as we've seen, ships and so on, that we know perfectly well are carrying, damn, this.
Just a little while ago, right inside that ferry, there were lots of burned trucks. And in plain sight, a truck full of mandarins, obviously meant for the holidays. A truck with mandarins there too, of course.
Yes, it must be said that this is a very Caribbean and very Russian tradition, eating tangerines on the last night of the year. It's not like grapes. You don't eat 2 tangerines, that would be a bit much. But yes, people eat tangerines and so on. It's a tradition. Anyway, the interesting part here is this. Putin said, well, that's it. We'll start directly attacking port targets, whether we like it or not, because we've had enough of them bringing in whatever they want. But he also said 2 more things, and this is what matters. He said, well, we'll think about it. I'm not saying we'll do it. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. About attacking much tougher targets and hitting all the facilities, not one specific bank, not a depot where we know there are weapons and so on, but a hard strike, he said. And the third option, if we have no other choice, is to completely cut off all capacity, both incoming and outgoing, for ships at the port of Odesa. In other words, we will shut down the port of Odesa. Just like that, it's over. That's as far as we go. And of course I was startled. Why was I startled? Because this ship we saw was supposedly carrying, well, diesel engines. No, yes, it did have those, but they said it was carrying something else. Wait, what it was actually carrying, because, well, this ship was attacked at sea, were containers from a company called AXA, a major manufacturer of diesel, gasoline, and gas generators, as well as power plants. This ship, and here's the funny part, was supposed to go to Romania, but somehow it ended up in Odessa. I mean, officially it was a ship, I think flying a Panamanian flag, that was supposed to go to Romania, that had Romania as its destination, but since it was nearby, well, it got confused. And hey, it ended up in Odessa. Of course, this is what the Russians have been seeing all the time. Ships that are supposedly headed to Romania, cargo that isn't really what it's said to be. In other words, something else entirely. And that's how things have gone, until they said, well look, here's the first warning. Boom. This. Because let's not forget, this is key, that in a situation of de-energization, of taking down energy infrastructure, mainly electrical or related to electricity, across all of Ukraine, and especially in the eastern sector, the alternative, when you take out a hydroelectric plant, is diesel generators. There's no other option. So we're talking about a key objective from a military point of view. They're not carrying, I don't know, bricks to build a house. No. They're carrying diesel generators to sustain whatever they decide. And obviously in a country at war and in a situation like Ukraine's, those diesel generators are mainly going to support the military effort. That's clear. In other words, Putin has said, this is as far as we go. And what we're going to see now is that this uncontrolled traffic that other Europeans were engaging in, mostly, will no longer be tolerated. He said, I remember now, first we'll attack, as we're doing now, Odesa and so on. That's fine. The second thing he said was, we'll attack ships. He didn't say European, but he said ships from foreign countries coming here, meaning he was pointing at the European Union. In other words, we'll attack your ship if you keep doing this. It doesn't matter what flag they fly. That is, the third option is the blockade. A total blockade of the port. Well, this is what we're seeing. And watch out, this is serious damage because in practice it means cutting off Ukraine's maritime supplies. And that's crucial. The port of Odessa is key for Ukraine right now. It's true they can bring things in, and they are bringing things in through Poland and other countries, mainly weapons and such. But the port activity of the only major port they have left, basically they have a couple of smaller ones. One is at the mouth not of the Dnipro, but of a smaller river. I mean, if we follow the curve of the Dnieper by Mykolaiv and around there, there's a river port somewhere here. Well, and then they have another one, that's why they mention Romania, which is on the Danube. Yes, that one's a small one. Well, that one was bombed today, by the way. Yes, the one in Nestor, exactly. And then they have another port they also use, I mean at the mouth of the Danube. There's a port in Romania on one side and another in Ukraine. I can't remember the name right now. Well, that's the one they often use too, and it's been bombed several times by the Russians. And all of this is going to end. I mean, all of this is already clear. With all these ports, this is as far as we've come. And this is a new, very harsh blow for Ukraine. One of its main supply routes, for almost everything, is coming to an end. That is, these attacks on the port of Odessa are not the same attacks they've been carrying out for a long time. This is an escalation regarding the port of Odessa. If they continue, it's also a severe blow to Sultan Erdogan, telling him, look, we can tolerate you playing double, triple, even quadruple games in some matters, but not in others. And that trafficking you were profiting from and all that, that's not going to happen. In fact, he met with Erdogan. He was in that meeting when those things happened. The thing with that ship, I think it was in Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, at some international gathering where several people were present. And well, what they saw was this. He showed it to Erdogan and they told him, look, the nonsense is over, meaning that business of illegal trafficking around here and so on. No, not anymore. And I think Erdogan lowered his head at that point. Erdogan was also saying, or at least it was rumored, that he was the port Fernando mentioned earlier, the port of Reni.
Este puerto mencionado por Fernando antes, el puerto de Reni, yo buscando este puerto de Reni entre
This port of Reni, between Moldova and Ukraine, very close to Romania. Yes, and to Ukraine too, right?
Sí, y de Ucrania también, ¿no?
Ukraine, of course.
I mean, it's right next to it. It's the port of Reni, exactly. And in fact, we've seen it many times. This is Moldova, this here is Romania, and this here is Ukraine, right?
Ukraine. Well, we've often seen the results of the bombings because the Romanians from the other side have filmed them. I mean, you just point your phone and boom.
Fernando, may I add a forward-looking perspective to your analysis? Because beyond Odessa's importance in today's Ukraine, in the Ukraine of the future, likely reduced, with Russia taking a large bite, possibly half of Ukraine, this entire section to the right of the Dnipro River, lost. Yes, the capture of Odesa, in addition to its Russian history and its significance in the Black Sea, would also determine whether that future Ukrainian state would have access to the sea or not. And if that future Ukrainian state, which will logically create an economic, political, and social black hole in Europe, and possibly within NATO, if that future Ukrainian state were to show even the slightest economic viability, then before long, NATO or its successor forces would once again want to drive a wedge into Russia through that future Ukrainian state. That is why it is so important to create a buffer here, in Odesa, both politically and militarily, as well as economically, for that future state, and thus turn it into a failed state, one that is more of a problem for the West than a platform for attacking Russia. That is the idea, obviously, as well.
And
in the end, that remaining state, somehow, even if it's formally independent and all that, whatever remains, and we don't even know what will remain, but anyway, will somehow be under Russia's supervision. That is, they won't be allowed to rearm, for NATO or the Europeans to rearm them, or for neo-Nazis to remain. This is important, meaning so they don't go back to their old ways. No, that can't happen. That's why in the end, what will remain of Ukraine will be a failed state, a failed buffer state under Russian oversight. And that's also why the entire political class currently in power in Ukraine will have to disappear. Let's not forget the three fundamental things Putin said, which he has been repeating from the beginning. He emphasized them in the famous document of June 14, 2024, when he said, "Look, let me make this very clear. This document I'm giving you here, this little paper, is not negotiable. These are the points that must be met in order to negotiate, which is not the same thing. And in that document were the three well-known points from the start. Ukraine cannot be in NATO or in anything resembling it, that is, there cannot be NATO forces there, and so on. Second, Ukraine cannot be armed to the teeth. Ukraine must be disarmed.
No puede estar armado hasta los dientes. Hay que desarmar a Ucrania. Se le puede permitir algo testimonial.
They can be allowed something symbolic like light weapons, things like that, and of course a reduction of the army. The Russians have already said that at most 85,000 men. At most. And third, denazification. What does this denazification mean? That all those from Azov and company, all the current leaders, out. They can't even hold the position of doorman at the presidential palace. That is, no. So that will have to be enforced no matter what. And let's see. As I said, denazification should basically be understood as the elimination of the entire current ruling class. These people can no longer hold public office, and some of them have to end up in prison. Members of the Russian State Duma have already talked about the need to create a tribunal equivalent to Nuremberg for the Ukrainian leaders. This has already been said, right? I mean, if we think the Russians are going to say, well, fine, we'll settle for the regions we have, and as for what remains in Ukrainian hands, they don't have to return it, and so on. That's a negotiating strategy. Just as it's being said, or, let's say, a strategy to buy time, they're also saying, no, well, yes, no, we're not against negotiations. But they'll give you something like what's happening with Trump, Wyckoff, and company talking to Zelensky. No, sure, we're not against it, but we're setting conditions we know you can't accept. Because other things have already been said. That is, if Zelensky and his people accept the neo-Nazis who hold key positions in the battalions and regiments, especially in the National Guard, they have already said they'll take them out, execute them, that they're not willing to accept that. So there will have to be an extraordinary purge. Because, let's not forget, there's a leadership layer made up of all kinds of Nazis, hyper-nationalists, admirers of Stepan Bandera and the Nazis. In other words, we see them everywhere. They don't even hide it. They display flags with the swastika, or variations of it, runes of all kinds, like those of the SS. This has to disappear. And that means that at the very least, all the leaders are out, and some of them straight to jail. And this is going to happen. Let's not fool ourselves. Just like the port of Odessa will be lost. Look, in Odesa, as in other regions, it will almost certainly be done the same way it was done at the time with the referendums in Zaporizhia, Kherson, and so on. Odesa. I'm one of those who think they won't need to enter Odesa militarily. Simply when the Ukrainians surrender, they'll say, well, we're going to Odessa to hold a referendum that they're going to win. And that's it. Problem solved. Let's not forget, moreover, that Odesa, well, you see, Putin said it once. One thing he doesn't forgive is betrayal. He said this. That is to say, the betrayal of the Europeans, of the Ukrainians in this case, and above all the harm inflicted on Russia. And let's not forget that one of the most terrible events of what was the Euromaidan didn't happen in Odessa. It happened in Odessa, the infamous fire at the trade union building, where about 50 people died, burned alive because those neo-Nazis set the place on fire. And well, with horrific images, Russian leaders constantly bring this up. In other words, it's not something that's been forgotten. Later, regions like Odessa, like Mykolaiv, and even others like Sumy and so on, are going to hold these referendums that they don't even need to falsify. Why? Because the most pro-Ukrainian population in those areas, which are mostly Russian-speaking, is going to be hurt. That is, when they see that this is going to fall into Russian hands, they'll leave, just as it would happen the other way around. I mean, if you're pro-Russian and the Ukrainians take a certain city, you're not going to stay there to get your head cut off. You're going to go to your area with your people, so to speak. Well, what we're going to see is a series of referendums, starting with Odesa, that will make more than half of Ukraine fall into Russian hands and be constitutionally incorporated, most likely, into Russia, as happened with Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Exactly like that.
All right, next stop. Obviously, it's not the one for the analysis of Odesa, but the next stop of, well, why are we presenting this? Usually we present on one hand the military analysis, the advances on the ground, the bombings, and on the other, the political analysis. Today, basically, we're doing a bit of political analysis and a bit of military analysis because of the relationship, the interconnection between both spheres, right? All of this appears interconnected, one determining the other. That's why we started with with the military analysis of Odesa, and now Fernando is doing an analysis of the political and geopolitical meaning of Odesa. Let's go a bit further now, Fernando, focusing on the military side. Well, major events from these last few days, at least the most important ones.
This is the key, isn't it? In fact, don't be surprised if, for example, next Wednesday or Sunday, Ezekiel and I can say right here that Guliai-Pol has fallen. I mean, we're not talking about 3 months from now, right? Because at the pace they're going, and we can see how they're pounding the tall buildings with those glide bombs of 1,500 or 3,000 kilos, anything over 500 kilos already seems pretty heavy to me. But anyway, right now, if we look at the map, you'll see that about roughly half of Guliai-Pol, which, let's not forget, is the last major stronghold the Ukrainians have in this part of Zaporizhia. Well, from here on Houston, we've got a problem, and a big one. So this, which is the last major stronghold, more or less, as I said, about half of it, what would be the western bank of the... I can never remember the name of this river. It's called... What's the name of this river again?
Chul, if I remember correctly.
El Chul, something like that, yes. A very unpronounceable thing.
Aichul.
Aichul, yes, something like that. Well, this river, everything that passes through Guliai-Pol, the entire eastern part, the area closest to the Russian front, all of that is already in Russian hands. If you look at the city, you can more or less see the urban layout, which means that roughly half of the city is under Russian control. The entire southern part, then this whole area, and also a section in the north. What we're seeing is a steady advance over the past few days, and I wouldn't be surprised if we ended up with a scenario like Urozhain, which, as you know, fell a few days ago. In other words, the final touch could be a rapid collapse. That is to say, once you've entered and hold half the city while fighting continues in the center, it could turn out like Avdiivka. From that point, the Ukrainian defense might collapse and they could withdraw. In fact, well, I won't get ahead of myself, but I don't see how anything else could happen because the situation here is very precarious. The Russians have kept advancing until they reach the eastern river, and practically that whole area is already in Russian hands. So the next step, once Guliai-Pol is taken, or while what's left of Guliai-Pol is being taken, is to cross the river, which has already been crossed in some places, and start advancing beyond it. In other words, this stage is already considered completed.
And look, not long ago, Fernando, I remember we were here together marking a milestone. The capture of part of this route, the P85. Yes. It had been cut off because of the logistics toward Guliai-Pol. From north to south. That was the last supply route. And the Russians about a week ago, if I remember correctly, had taken a small section here, cutting it off, and we presented it as something crucial. Well, from then until now, that entire road, located on the right bank of this river, is already under Russian control. The latest area taken, or at least confirmed, remember this is a very cautious mapper, the latest confirmed today. Here are images of the capture of the last small village that was still left there. We were able to witness it, as always. First the bombings, the drone attacks. I think it was Varoviska, but I'm not sure, or something similar.
Creo que era Varoviska, pero estoy seguro, ¿eh? O uno parecido. Es decir, pero vamos, todo esto ya en manos rusas.
But anyway, all of this is already in Russian hands. There we see a drone that, boom. All of this in Russian hands, and indeed with incredible speed. And from now on, look, we almost have to talk about the Guliai issue in the past tense. I mean, because, as I said, what's left will probably fall next week. And from here, if we look at the map and notice the elevation, let's say where Guliai is located, we see that Guliai and this entire front they've opened from Andriivka, more or less, to Guliai. From there, if you draw a straight line, more or less, you ask yourself, where does this go? Well, it's roughly at the level of the city of Zaporizhzhia, the capital. That means that from here, as we've mentioned many times, the Ukrainians are going to be hit from the rear. And there's really no solution for that. Then after Huliaipol, we're going to see a relatively quick collapse of the front in this area, in this sector, stretching from Huliaipol to Orikhiv, where the Russians are already on the move, attacking from Mala-Tokmashka.
Mala-Tokmashka, which they've half taken at this point. We're showing the video now, Fernando. I'll bring up the map again right now. Don't worry, I'm here watching this. But well, here are the flags and everything else. In this video, several scenes. Here, Fernando, something you've mentioned several times. This thing about exiting through the side doors, running from the drones. Here's one, here's another, and another. And the one who can't get out, like in this case, the vehicle.
Well, that's bad news.
Bad prospects, huh? Alright, Fernando.
That's why we've also mentioned that, as you can see, they're vehicles, let's say more or less modified passenger cars. In other words, regular cars that move more easily on the roads than an armored vehicle, which is slower and less maneuverable. And as we've already seen in some videos, sometimes if there's time, they remove the doors so they can get out faster.
Lada Niva, a small Lada off-road vehicle, like an AK-47. Cheap, simple, but very reliable. You see a lot of those. Fernando, can we go over that attack line again towards Zaporizhzhia?
Exactly. Look, what we were saying before. We have to, if you more or less line up right now with the front, which goes from Andriivka, let's not get confused, or Lidovne, or something like that. Wait, it's just that they even put the dots over the activities. Let's see, if we go from, it would be more or less Lidovne or something like that. Approximately, if you like, from Zaryene or Nariska, or from Ostapiske. Honestly, what names? Let's see, yes, all the way up Danilivka. Look for Danilivka. And there, they've already crossed, I'm telling you, in the river at some points, from Danilivka, just to give a reference. It doesn't really matter up there at the top. That is to say, if we move down, we can see that there we have the front line, which more or less coincides with the river. And if we zoom out and draw a straight line, we can see that from here, from the northernmost part of the front, not from Huliaipol, but from the northernmost part of this consolidated front, which is fairly linear, relatively homogeneous, once Huliaipol is taken, then from the northern part, if you draw a straight line, you reach Polohi, the capital. Yes. So, what does this mean? It means that this advance from Huliaipole, which is even farther north than Orikhiv, for example, once they start moving forward, that will mean they'll be hitting all the Ukrainian fortification lines from the rear, from behind, where there are no fortifications. Ezekiel points that out very clearly. And for this, there is no plan. There is no plan B. That is, there are no more troops, no more time. The lines can't be stabilized at the pace of the Russian advance. So even though you mentioned time earlier, well, that creating a new defensive zone, this is going to collapse, I think, in a relatively short time, in a few months. This winter, I think we might see that all of this has collapsed, because on top of that, the Russians are pressing from the east, but also right now from the south, in Orikhiv, in the city or the town of Malotokmashka, which is very hard to pronounce, and from Novodanilivka. There they are. From there, they're operating. Novodanilivka is practically on the outskirts of Orikhiv. I mean, the distance is minimal. If you look at it, it's very clear on the map. These are practically the outskirts. And they're going to come in from the south, from the part that isn't fortified. In other words, you're going to have more problems. And they're also putting pressure from there. That is, pressure from the east, pressure from the south, and then pressure from the southeast. From the Dnipro coast area, from Kaminsky heading north. Stepanasisk is almost taken, and the latest movements we're seeing from the Russians show that they're moving further north along that line, toward Madalinivka. In other words, they're advancing to take all these areas until they reach Jirovika, farther north, which are defensive zones that usually take advantage of rivers and similar features. But the pressure is enormous, so right now they don't have enough troops. In other words, there's a problem. They're stretched too thin. They're pulling forces from other places, but they just don't have enough.
Next stop on this journey, Fernando.
All right, but let's get straight to it.
With such detail, let us now present precisely Pokrovsk and the remaining little part of Mirnohrad.
Yes, well, the situation here is crystal clear. As for Pokrovsk, well, what's left is basically nothing. You can see it there. Ezekiel is pointing it out. Look, nothing. Just a small yellow pocket inside an area that's completely surrounded. What remains of Mirnohrad might be the surrenders from yesterday in the city, those soldiers capitulating. They have no other option right now, except that or death. And we have that city, which is shaped like a larger part, a narrow section, and another larger part to the north and south. Well, the south was taken some time ago. The center too, half of it, let's say, the northeast as well. What's left is a small core here, which, well, will probably fall next week. The Russians already see it as something secondary. For them, it's no longer a main front. They know this is a pocket that's going to fall. They keep bombing it with glide bombs and advance calmly, taking prisoners and so on. So this is already just a token holdout, and, well, this week or at the latest next week, I think they're going to finish it off. And, well, the few who remain will end up surrendering. This is already settled. And now, as we said the other day, the advances are already focusing on Dnipropetrovsk. We saw that the southern part of Chasiv Yar is taken by the Russians. Kirchner is going to fall, that's, well, undeniable. And then from there, from Udashne, which is a bit further south, this whole area is going to fall. That is, the whole area from Kotlin northward is going to fall. And from, as we've said before, from the Udashne area, they're going to move toward Pervomaiske. And that's practically done. It's very easy for them because one of the, let's say, support points on that road, the T046, in the only village that's practically left on that route, since it goes straight, which is Novopokrovske or something like that, already has part of the village taken. That is to say, this small town will be conquered quickly as soon as they decide to advance, and they will reach Meshova, which is a key logistical hub. And we'll see this happen soon as well. Then, in other words, throughout this area, in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, the Ukrainians are facing very serious problems. They're doing what they can, but they don't have enough troops. Everyone acknowledges this now. Let's move on, if you like, to Kostiantynivka. Kostiantynivka will be advancing mainly in the south.
Bueno, pues Kostiantynivka está avanzando sobre todo en el sur.
Quería presentar un video muy interesante.
I wanted to show a very interesting video that was posted just a few minutes ago, here, from Pokrovsk. The idea is it's still downloading. Now apparently yes, pay attention to these images. Let's see from Pokrovsk. This platform, dear. There we go.
Fíjate, tremendo.
Look at that. Incredible. Riano Bosti. This was done with a drone, right? What is it? This video is spectacular. It's a long video, but I recommend watching it because it gives us a very real perspective of what war looks like from the air. Also, as you can see there are Russian flags in different high areas, but it's a pretty battered city. Not as much as others. I mean, this city still has tall buildings standing.
There are other cities that no longer have them. The Soviet buildings, right? Those little boxes, the panel buildings. What endurance these buildings have, my dear.
Yes, they're very ugly, but very solid. I've been living, well, staying as a guest with friends and so on for days there, in this kind of building that doesn't have an elevator. If they're 5 or 6 story buildings, what do we consider a house here?
Here in Germany, with an elevator, Fernando, these buildings.
The thing is, those from the GDR, well, in the GDR people drank really well, more than most would think. I mean, people would say they were starving in the German Democratic Republic. Not at all. Another matter is that there was tremendous control there and so on, but, well, you can see it here.
In Spanish they call it, according to Wikipedia, the same as in German, Plattenbau. Basically, these are buildings constructed with large prefabricated slabs. Those rectangular panels, sometimes visible, brought in on big trucks and joined together. Here are the more modern ones, with elevators on every floor, and some even with elevators only on the odd-numbered floors. A very curious feature you only see here. So you can go up to the 3rd, the 5th, and then... Look how nice the urban landscape looks here. The area with more central buildings.
What we always say, look at the cities, extraordinarily open. I mean, it's just that maybe, for example, if you see that it had about 10,000 inhabitants before the war, and you see those areas meant for 10,000 inhabitants, here 10,000 people would be packed into nothing, that is, into 4 streets. And well, this is a desolate landscape. But watch out, because if we Europeans keep acting foolishly and provoking the Russians, maybe it'll turn out that these landscapes, if things keep going the same way in the coming years, with Europeans playing dumb and dodging responsibility because of the crisis and the European disaster, we'll end up provoking the Russians and finding ourselves with this. But not in Ukraine anymore. We'll find it in Germany, we'll find it in France, maybe. I mean, we'll find it in the United Kingdom, and so on.
They're visible, Fernando, in the construction of these buildings. Those large squares joined together. It's very curious, the doorways, very solid, right? Very, very solid.
The entryways are, let's say, quite Spartan, right? The bare minimum. I mean, well, from what I've seen when I was both in Ukraine and in Russia, it's true that buildings of about 5 or 6 stories usually don't have an elevator. If they have more than 5 or 6 stories back in the Soviet Union, then yes, they would install an elevator. One of those that sometimes stops on one floor or another. Yes, because they'd say, well, come on, if you have to climb 10 floors.
There again, the license plates in plain sight.
Yes.
I also remember, during a visit a long time ago to a friend in Poland, the quality of the construction and, in general, those panel buildings in Poland, in Wrocław, the city of Wrocław, or Breslau in German, which in Polish they called Wrocław. And if I remember correctly, in Spanish we say Breslavia. a beautiful Polish city with much from the Prussian era. Well, much more modest, much less, yes, much more, what's the word? Not ordinary.
Austere, so to speak.
Austere, like what you'd find in Soviet Germany or Soviet Poland, right? But the great strength of these buildings, Fernando, the only way to destroy them is through attacks, and even then, they just end up burned.
No. Some of them are even seeing that maybe he knocked down one part, the central part. But there are still buildings standing on the sides. I mean, the whole building hasn't collapsed. Here you have a building that's fallen down in one section.
But pay attention, that one made of bricks, this one made of bricks. That's why this one has collapsed. That's how old buildings were in Berlin or in Germany. Very old load-bearing brick buildings, not with columns and beams like modern constructions, but with extremely thick walls, each one with, here I am talking quietly, and none of my gestures are visible. Walls almost a meter thick, with bricks instead of columns. And that was also very strong, but in this case, the building clearly fell because of a bomb. So, yes, more resistant than modern constructions, but less than the Soviet panel buildings. Each of those buildings is truly a fortress, isn't it?
Indeed.
How architectural today, huh? So architectural.
No, but to understand the war, in this case the war in Ukraine, which has both a physical and human landscape, a geography that is both physical and human, and that has nothing to do with the countries of Western Europe, for example France, Germany, or Spain. We're talking about something else, that is, vast expanses. And we're seeing it again. That's why when we sometimes look at a map and see a little line and say how strange, it's because they've advanced, but they've advanced along one of those lines of trees that frame the large fields. And of course that's why there's a little line, because they've advanced along that line of trees. And that's it, they've reached that point. That is to say, this explains a lot about the war. Geography, in other words. It's not the same to take a city like Paris, for example, a dense city, despite the magnificence of Paris with its grand buildings, wide avenues, and all that. But still, let's say, with many crowded, tight areas, as compared to those other cities that spread out over vast areas. Because we've already seen it, and even in that view we saw of Prokhorovka, there's hardly any way to talk about city blocks. Why? Because there weren't many buildings close together forming a square or something like it. There are spaces between them, and we're talking about residential buildings.
In fact, Fernando, as a projection for a possible war in Europe, something I once heard from a friend from Madrid, many of the old buildings in Madrid and other parts of Spain, buildings from before the 19th century, have wooden structures. Very, very old buildings. Tall, 5 or 6 stories high, at least by today's standards. Maybe back then they were fewer, 4, but with very high ceilings. The original structures of those buildings from the 18th century, possibly from around 1700, are made of wood. If a bomb were to fall there, that building would collapse immediately, because it doesn't have such solid structures, right? My idea about France, well, I don't know much about French buildings, but it might be the same.
But above all, that urban structure. In the end, since everything is so close together, we don't have that chessboard or grid layout here. Not here. Here the streets are tight. There's a row of buildings, then a street, and across from it another row of buildings. Those blocks, in the strict sense, don't really form here. In the Russian world, those blocks are very large, and even when they're closed, they have no openings, except for the entrances and such. There's a huge green space inside that grid of buildings. Not here. This doesn't exist here. This doesn't exist here. I mean, that is to say, in fact, the war here would have to be very different. I mean, obviously the Russians are not going to invade Spain, I can tell you that right now. That's not going to happen. But assuming there were a Spanish city like that in Ukraine, and they had to take it, they would have to do it in a completely different way. Because you have to adapt, just as you adapt to mountainous terrain, for example, in Greece, which is a very mountainous country. Low mountains, but still very mountainous. That is, to this which is a plain. If this country is a plain, except for the forested area, and all of this is the most difficult area and the most densely urbanized area, which is Donetsk.
Then we have, so I don't go on too long, the pressure. A little more, Fernando, yes, and we'll wrap up the map thing.
All right, come on, let's go to Sivers, mainly so I can tell you to take a look at the map of Sivers. Look at what the city is. Already taken a few days ago, not 3 years ago, taken a few days ago, and right now they've already made the next to last advance. The Russians are already quite far from Sivers, roughly from Platonivka, which is in Russian hands, to Sviatopolkrovsk, which is also in Russian hands. All of this, if we draw that line, is already taken. In other words, they've taken this in the last 3 days, not much more. That is to say, the collapse of Siversk is already causing a very fast, extremely fast advance. And if it continues at this pace, they'll practically reach the level of Dubrova and quickly gain one of the key connections towards Sloviansk, which is the E40. They already have it from another side, but at the speed they're moving, if you look now at what's coming from the Siversk area, you, with your knack for measuring distances to Sloviansk, you'll see it's not very far anymore. We're basically there.
On the outskirts, here, this isn't the tool, this one here is. Now yes, 25, 26 kilometers, more or less, Fernando.
At the pace they're going, they'll be on the outskirts by the end of this winter at the latest.
And then, on this very important road, the MO3, which supplies Sloviansk and the entire Sloviansk-Kramatorsk axis, and, further down, Konstantinivka, the Ukrainians have already started installing nets, still quite far from the front, but anticipating a future Russian advance. They have already placed anti-drone nets along that entire road. This is also an image from today.
It's fundamental. Maintaining logistics is the key in all wars. And in this one, what we're seeing is that it's very difficult to sustain. Russian superiority right now is wreaking havoc on the Ukrainians. Then, in Lyman, well, they're there. There haven't been major advances. And we can move on to the well-known mess in Kupiansk that's happening right now. I say mess because it's not at all clear who is where, and that needs to be explained. You see, many times, and especially in urban warfare, it's very complicated. That is, sometimes one street today is in the hands of one side, or even a neighborhood, and tomorrow it's in the hands of the other, or in the same area they're mixed together. To the point of no return, right? This is testified by the soldiers themselves, both Ukrainian and Russian. It's possible that in this building there are Russians, in the one next door there are Ukrainians, and in the one a little farther away there are Russians again. So drawing a line is impossible. In fact, all the commentators, the ones who make maps and so on, were saying that it's very hard right now to know who is where. Why? Because most likely not even the Russians or the Ukrainians are sure about it. This is a desperate attempt, completely senseless. But well, that is to add the ISW so that, in these conversations between Zelensky and the Europeans and Americans, they can claim or say they've had a victory. They're burning through units here as always, without rhyme or reason. It's true that they've retaken part of Kupiansk, an important part. The Russians in the western part of Kupiansk really are in trouble, let's be honest. They're in trouble because the Ukrainians have managed to advance quite a bit. But the thing is, well, they're burning troops in counterattacks, that even if they allowed them to take all of western Kupiansk, you'd say, well, and now what? Because the problem is that this advance can't be exploited anymore. Why? Because they don't have a second echelon, they don't have reserves, and that's what's happening in all the counterattacks we're seeing the Ukrainians try.
Even if you succeed, why is Zelensky so obsessed with Kupiansk, dear Fernando?
Well, among other things, because the Russians also, from time to time, the Ministry of Defense gets ahead of itself and declares something conquered when it's almost conquered, but not quite. They practically announced the capture of Kupiansk. Gerasimov, in the last meeting he had with Putin and so on, said no, this is done and so forth. So it's a way to make the Russians look bad. That is, no, look, not only is it not done, but we've actually regained part of it. So, Mr. Gerasimov, you're wrong. Then one of the longest battles, well, you present it as not only have we not lost Kupiansk, but we've taken it back, and therefore we still have a chance to keep fighting, and so on, which is basically what Zelensky argues.
Indeed, a media conflict, a media war. The Russians with their, we've already conquered it, and Zelensky rejected that from the start. Syrskyi rejected it too. And that's why there's such an emphasis, to a large extent, on the capture of this city, on Ukraine's recapture of this city. And here, Fernando, something from today, within the framework of this media dispute, Zelensky posting this, but with a little trick.
Yeah, a little trick. Quite a trick. Zelensky in front of the Kupiansk sign. Look at the sign, huh?
And look at the little flag here. Keep an eye on it.
Here it comes out with the nets too. Here are these meshes. These, how brave, right, Fernando?
Yes, today, this president, and without a helmet too. Today this, yes, glory to Ukraine, but well.
But of course, then the Russians said, well, let's send a drone to see if he's really there. And what you see is something different. Look, the Kupiansk letters have already fallen down, several of the ones we had seen before. The Ukrainian flag is gone. This is a drone that flew over and recorded the area. The fences are destroyed, broken. What happened? Because this is an older recording from some time ago. That is, when things weren't as bad yet in Kupiansk, and they presented it as brave Zelensky on the front line and all that. But no. In other words, a setup, in this case a very crude one, which the Russians were able to expose quickly by sending a drone and saying, look, this is what it looks like now, and it doesn't match.
Even around here, someone also made a video of this place with, if luck helps me, sorry. I here in Kupiansk, this is from today, a video from here about Zelensky's selfie, showing that area from a car. Soldiers, women.
Today they've been seen, yes, today they've been seen. Look, now that you mention it, what I see is that today quite a few videos have been seen, well, several videos of soldiers, women in frontline areas.
What's the name? What do you call female soldiers? Soldadas.
To me, soldada sounds really wrong because at least in Castilian Spanish, soldada means the pay given to soldiers.
The soldiers' pay.
That is, soldada was the payment given to soldiers, whether they were doing military service or whatever. It was called soldada. So I think soldados in general applies to both women and men.
Because the soldiers, this is their video showing that Zelensky's video is fake.
Of course. At this point, does anyone still think that anything shown to us by Zelensky's regime has any credibility? But does that mean the Russians don't lie? Of course they lie. They're at war. I mean, come on, in war you don't tell the whole truth, and you have to give, well, exaggerations at the very least about the enemy's casualties. For example, no, instead of having 100,000, they've had 200,000, because you have to.
Now, for them to make a fake propaganda video, to stage something, that happens within the framework of a propaganda war. Hooked. Now, within the context of the media war between Zelensky and Russia, well, more than between Zelensky and Russia, because the Russians don't really take part in this much, and maybe foolishly so, because that shows a clear weakness in the media dimension. It's really more of a media issue aimed at the West and at their own, oh there, escaping quickly. Probably because of the arrival of new drones. Well, just in case, I won't show any more. Maybe someone there is hurt now. 1 second, because I can hear shouting in the background. That, within the framework of the media war, they stage something. Well, that seems predictable. But that, within the framework of the media war, they send Ukrainian soldiers en masse to certain death in Kupiansk. That makes no sense. It's a war crime. For their people, it's terrible.
Yes, I mean, an absolute contempt. But as we've said many times, in the clique that rules Ukraine right now, there are two kinds of people. One, the corrupt opportunists who jumped on the bandwagon, who have used all this to get rich and couldn't care less about anything. They have absolute contempt and no morality toward their citizens, and they couldn't care less what happens to Ukrainians. And then there are the neo-Nazis, who for different reasons, that is, they actually believe they're fighting a more or less holy war, but who also despise their own citizens, who think they must be sacrificed, practically all of them if necessary, rather than let the Russians win, something that doesn't even cross their minds. So, well, here we have two kinds of disgraceful people. The others are corrupt too, I mean the neo-Nazis. Everyone here is corrupt.
It may be precisely for this reason that these Ukrainian soldiers drove around the place where Zelensky's supposed video was recorded, as a demonstration by the Ukrainian armed forces themselves of the president's lies. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but today they released this video in response to Zelensky's video from yesterday. And on the other hand, Fernando, in Zelensky's case, every city he visited, and where he documented his presence with one of those videos, all the cities where he filmed in front of those monoliths, in front of those signs, are now in Russian hands. It's as if he brings about the fall of the cities.
Three more. You know that thing, half joking, half serious, about the handshake. I mean, every time Zelensky meets a new leader, he shakes hands, gives a hug and all that. And before long, that leader ends up falling. He's made quite a mess in Europe, from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Scholz. They all end up losing elections. Everything. I'm telling you, he's bad luck. This guy is bad luck.
Clearly, in Argentina they would call us Yeta, being Yeta. Yeta? Yes, a novel called Yeta Tori.
Well, yeah, I mean, this guy is something else. But anyway, all this, let's imagine the Ukrainians take Kupiansk. And if you can't exploit it, any success you have, so what? It would just delay, in this sector of the front, the Russians taking Kupiansk again. But this wouldn't change the dynamics of the war at all. I mean, these are, as we've pointed out, propaganda moves, where they're also sacrificing units for nothing. Because apparently, Zelensky ordered Syrskyi to retake it no matter what, even if half the Ukrainian population is lost there. In other words, it doesn't matter. Well then, and after that, just a few brief comments. Well, in Bolsan they're still at it, and there's no need to even show the map. As we say here in Spain, we were few, and the grandmother gave birth. So a front that was relatively stable, the one in Sumy, has flared up again. That means an area that hadn't been moving is now active, with the Russians retaking small villages and so on. And this creates more problems, because the Chans are still the same, meaning they keep advancing. And now in Sumy, the Russians have reactivated things again. In other words, it forces, just as we've said before, the Ukrainians to pin down troops at a time when they don't have enough troops. If you have to station troops in every sector of the front, because there's movement, that is, counterattacks, attacks, and so on from the Russians, then that leads to what we're seeing now. Since you don't have enough forces, you collapse. You collapse on one side and then on the other. The question now is, will they hold out? I mean, the big question is, will Zelensky's regime make it through the whole winter or not? That's the question. I mean, it's no longer about saying, no, it's just that. You can't help but laugh when you see Europeans saying, no, we're going to fund them so they can hold out until 2027. You think, what are these people talking about? I mean, it's absurd. This isn't going to last until 2027. Things like that, you know?
Well then, just like that, dear Fernando, just as sometimes we lack geopolitical facts to support our analyses, some days with less information, fewer facts, fewer events. Today, truly, in these past few weeks, geopolitical events have proliferated. We would have also presented, in addition to everything we discussed today, something about the attack by ISIS members against US soldiers in Syria and the US response today, bombing and patrolling the streets of Palmyra in Syria. We would have also presented Israel's attacks on Gaza today. An attack, or rather, a terrorist attack involving 2 assailants in Australia, with heroic footage of a civilian who basically neutralizes one of the attackers. Another attack also took place in the United States, but we were going to present it. We won't be able to show it because it's already 11:10 at night in Europe, and Santiago Martinez's program is about to start. Very important, we're going to make room for him. I just want to remind everyone, before closing, that there was a small issue with the memberships. That's why all our members received a message. Santiago's memberships from the channel Demoliendo Mitos were cancelled. Well, we've reactivated them. You can subscribe to the memberships again. Please help us that way. We're also going to add an extra benefit. Besides supporting the channel and a few other things, we'll be offering an additional perk in the coming days. And for today, Fernando, we're going to pause the analysis for a bit, for a few days, until our next meeting on Wednesday, with this spectacular image of Odesa in the shadows, truly cinematic as well. Fernando, whatever you'd like to say to wrap up, just briefly.
Nothing, I'll just be quick. As Ezekiel pointed out, in each program one tries to focus on 2 or 3 things, 4 at most. But really, as I said last Friday, we're living in a world at war. And as a general overview, I also talked about Ukraine, but also about the situation in Yemen. Not about the Houthis, but about the conflict between the Emiratis and the Saudis with their local proxies. In other words, the allies were fighting each other, and quite fiercely, among other things, over control of the oil in Hadramaut province, and so on. And there's also something else that's not being talked about much, but that right now is in a very tense and serious situation. The new clash, harsher than the one that happened in the summer, between Cambodians and Thais, to the point that the Thais have already said they don't care what Trump says, that they're going to keep going, and that this can't be stopped anymore. In other words, just to give 2 more examples, without even getting into the mess that's been stirred up across Africa and so on. In short, we really are in a world at war, and we could just start pinpointing locations. Here's a conflict, here's another, and another. And we'd see that right now, a large part of the world is burning, literally or figuratively, in a hybrid war, as we've pointed out.
como hemos señalado. Así que...
And now the American continent as well, Fernando Moragón, with Trump's attacks on Venezuela.
Venezuela, and so on. And with a Trump, we have no idea how he's going to get out of this mess.
Demoledores y demoledoras, muchas gracias como siempre.
Demolishers, thank you very much, as always, for being with us. Please remember to give us a like if you haven't yet, free subscriptions, memberships, and also support us through PayPal. Don't forget to support our sister channel, DMP Geopolitics, our English language channel, Demolishing Political Myths, and our TikTok account with the best shorts. We reactivated it recently. We're building a media empire, Fernando.
Generando un imperio mediático, Fernando.
Sí. Ya, y si además algún día ganamos,
Yeah, right. And if someday we even make some money, that's going to be amazing. Just a little, but still. That's why I say, anyway, the effort, and if on top of that we make money, wow, that's going to be incredible. It's going to be something else. If we finally stop being broke, well. And to the Demolidoras, a hug and see you next time, dear Fernando. Bye-bye. See you later.
Fernando, querido, chau, chau.
hasta luego.
Yeah.